Jose, appreciate you taking the time today.
Oh, thank you very much, Mark. It's really nice to be here, and yeah, I appreciate the fact that you invite me to share, the little knowledge or as much knowledge as I have in this area. So it's really a pleasure.
I'm excited to be diving into this topic of low energy availability as well, because it's such a hot topic at the moment with trying to fuel, especially in an Olympic year when athletes are really pushing themselves. But before we dive into that, maybe you can tell listeners and viewers a little bit more about yourself and give us a little whirlwind tour of what's gotten you to Liverpool John Moores.
Yes, of course. So I'm Jose Areta. Currently, I'm a lecturer in sports nutrition in Liverpool John Moores University. I've been here for now almost like 3 years, but I ended up here after going around the world a little bit. So I'm originally from Argentina, trained as a biologist with a minor in zoology. And then I specialized in sports nutrition in Australia. So I had the opportunity to do a really cool PhD there, working I was based in Melbourne, but doing a bit of work at the Australian Institute of Sport as well, like doing experimental trials there. So basically, I got like a lot of training but basically working in a lab with humans and running trials and so on, and understanding what science, like proper science, was all about. So I absolutely loved it. Had the experience there to work with John Hawley, Louis Burke, and Vernon Coffey, and a lot of really good researchers from whom I learned a lot. So that was really, really great. So my PhD, was more focused on the effect of protein intake and how to maximize microfibrillary protein synthesis. And already back then, I was very interested in the effect of low energy availability. And one of the studies of my PhD was on that topic.
Okay.
But when you're a PhD student, you're kind of dancing with like different topics. You don't really know what you like, and then you explore different things. And so I went to do a postdoc in a Norwegian School of Sports Sciences in Oslo afterwards. And I was really, really interested in the effect of, or how skeletal muscle glycogen is used, so the dynamics of skeletal muscle glycogen. And at one point, I also became really interested in the interaction between energy availability and muscle glycogen, because I think these two things, are kind of interrelated.
Yeah.
So I kind of started working on that during my postdoc. And first, I really focused on the effect of exercise intensity and duration on skeletal muscle glycogen, and that led also to do a study on looking at differentiating the effect of energy availability and muscle glycogen. My postdoc at the end came to an end. It was 3 years postdoc, do a few things there, and then the opportunity for lectureship came up, and so I came to Liverpool, where when you start a new position at the university, you kind of have to say, okay, what do I want to do, or how do I want to develop, and so on. And I really found this topic really, really interesting. So I've been focusing on this since I arrived here, really. So we have a few lines of work in this area.
Nice. I was going to say literally around the world, from Argentina to Australia to Norway to Liverpool. That's pretty cool. And, in our discussion today about low energy availability, a few years back, I had Jen Saigo on who walked us through some of the research at that point. But to get everyone up to speed, can we do a quick definition of low energy availability? And then we can jump into some of the areas that you've brought about in one of your recent papers on low energy availability in female athletes.
Yeah, of course. I suppose that what is important to understand first is like what energy availability is, and then we can say what is low energy availability. So, broadly speaking, energy availability is the energy from dietary intake that is available for physiological processes. What does this mean? Is that we basically eat food that has energy, and when we subtract the energy from exercise, the energy used towards the exercise, or the energy cost of exercise, that energy available is the energy availability for maintenance of the
rest of the stuff to keep us alive and pump the heart and ventilate the lungs and all that good stuff, right?
Yes, exactly. And, this is the current definition that we use for energy availability as it's applied in humans. It's not what originally was defined as when it was defined in the 80s for using like rodent models, where they consider energy availability any energy available in the rodents for energy, so inclusive the fat stores. For us in humans, we just consider basically the day-to-day energy intake, the input of energy, and then the output of energy is mainly the exercise energy expenditure.
Yeah.
So the calculation or the definition of this can be defined mathematically in very simple terms, which is the energy intake minus the exercise energy expenditure normalized to the fat-free mass, which is the more metabolically active tissue.
I guess this is where a lot of the papers and discussion really jumps off, doesn't it? Because that idea of being able to calculate something so cleanly from a direct standpoint, a mathematical standpoint, and when we go from the lab into the field, there are obviously, as you know, those complexities that come up. So can you talk us through, a few areas like being able to, the pitfalls of measuring energy intake, between food recalls and interviews and questionnaires, how accurate are those really when we're looking at intakes for clients or athletes?
Yeah, so one of the issues here is that, a lot of these like really clear cut, definitions of what is normal energy availability and what is low and so on comes from a lab-based studies where we can control very much exactly how much energy people are expending in the lab and how much people were giving them giving to our participants. The problems, when you go to the field, it's like this is incredibly difficult to really quantify this precisely. So there's a lot of error in the measurement. So there's different ways of measuring energy intake, and there's different ways of measuring energy expenditure.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, what we are more interested in is like exercise energy expenditure. So the energy expenditure allocated from exercise only. And there's a lot of caveats of the different methodologies of dietary recalls. Also, because when we want to see the effect of energy availability or low energy availability, normally we need to know this over prolonged periods of time. And, even if you can have a really controlled, follow-up of dietary intake over a week, let's say of a participant or of an athlete, probably even though in 1 week you can see some of the effects of this energy availability, you probably need like months of data to know exactly what is happening. And then it becomes very, very difficult to be precise in the measurements.
Yeah, I was going to say, this idea of when you're researching it and studying it, having some bigger gaps, really, some bigger increases and drops in the amount of energy available. The study you noted around male cyclists, where on certain days there's an excess and other days there's a dramatic drop, and there's actually, no real difference in some of those biomarkers, which we'll talk about in a minute. But as we build this out over weeks and months, then it becomes potentially obviously more problematic, not just from a performance standpoint, but obviously from a health standpoint. So are there some low marker points that we should be looking out for with athletes where things start to go wrong?
Well, yes and no. So we have some data. There's a lot of data sort of from cross-sectional studies where we pick populations that we think they might have been exposed to low energy availability. There are like some clear markers of being exposed to low energy availability. And we have some data from experimental studies which are quite short in time, where this low energy availability is well controlled. Mm. Traditionally, the way in which low energy availability was kind of detected in sort of the symptoms observed, particularly in female athletes, which was the first type of athletes where this was studied, was basically bone mineral density and menstrual function. This is the female athlete triad, which considers the coexistence of low energy availability, low bone mineral density, and alteration of menstrual cycle. Basically points towards these very important symptoms of chronic low energy availability.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the end of the spectrum, isn't it? Over time of getting to those points, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So that's sort of when you see that, it's a bit too late.
So going off the cliff at that point.
Yes. So there's a cascade of events. The first thing that responds in your body typically is your metabolism and your sort of your hormones. So these things seem to be the ones that first start to pick up that you're in like low energy availability.
Yeah. So not consuming enough or training too hard, or typically a combination of both, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we didn't go very much into detail there, but the way to reduce energy availability is either keep eating the same that you eat every day and then train harder, expend more energy in exercise, or just eat less, or a combination of both. So you can have someone who doesn't change the diet; they are effectively eating normally, but they're still, their body is like, oh, this is like some sort of starvation response, even though the athlete is not starving. So
training
I
for an
think
ultra marathon and you haven't adjusted the intake,
pretty
for example.
much, yes. And this is something that we see on the field. When we start to be really detailed in the quantification of intake and expenditure, it's very clear that when athletes expend a lot of energy, they don't really sort of compensate for the exercise energy expenditure.
Yeah, and some of that earlier work done in women, where you're looking at 4 or 5 days of this energy availability being sort of roughly less than 30 kcal per kilogram fat-free mass per day, and then even then we're starting to see some shifts in some of those endocrine and metabolic markers. Would that be correct?
Correct, yes. So I think that there is, as I was saying before, there is some sort of a chain of events that starts with the metabolic and endocrine responses. So the first things that you normally see to respond to low energy availability are things like leptin seems to be very sensitive, but normally it's hard to measure or get it measured in a commercial lab. And most of them don't do leptin; it's more for research.
Mm-hmm.
But things like FT3 or like T3, that's one that seems to be quite sensitive, particularly in females. T4 not so much. IGF-1 seems to be quite sensitive as well. So these are parameters that are good, to look into when you are potentially working with someone that might be exposed to periods of low energy availability.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting on the thyroid front. Obviously, in athletes, docs will tend to run more of the T3 as well, but oftentimes in a recreational athlete or client, it's only T4 that might be run. And so can you
Yes.
talk through, obviously, the thyroid hormones are the main regulators here of resting metabolic rate. Why T3 potentially, not T4 so much?
So T3 is like the more sort of active hormone. So, T4 is converted to T3 in different tissues,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in the brain as well. There's a conversion from T4 to T3.
Yeah.
So basically what you measure when you measure T4 is whether, if there is less or more circulating of inactive hormone. That if you have hypothyroidism, then that might be something that you can detect. But in this case, it's different. It's more like the conversion from one to the other. So when you are in low energy availability, it's less of a conversion of T4 to T3, and even some studies see a tendency, an increase in T4 with low energy availability, which is interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting, and it's interesting when I look at the the numbers in your paper around even at 25 kcal per kilogram fat-free mass for that kind of 5-day period, we're seeing decreases in a sort of a dose response relationship going down towards 20, 19, 18. So that's at that point, even if we're picking it up, that's a pretty low intake for that week or that 5 days, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And, some of the things that are kind of tricky here is when we see changes in these hormones that might be subclinical. So it's hard to, run a test in this hormone and say like, oh, like this person
Definitely
is
definitely this.
yes, because, I think what is important to consider is the within individual variations in the hormone, because there might still be within a clinical values, but the thing is that it's dropped. I think that is the
Relative to
reason.
that athlete or individual, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think, this is what it makes it hard to pick up sometimes, because most of the time it's just one test, every now and then, and you go like, oh no, it's fine, it's within the clinical range. But when you look at, when you have the opportunity to look at many athletes or many individuals, as we do in the research studies, that's definitely going down. So I think, in this case, it's important to know the error of measurement of the hormones that you're measuring, how much it normally varies within that person, and so on. So it requires a bit of like attention to detail, but it's something that can give some guidance before things get disrupted further.
It's interesting because it's with any kind of complex condition or chronic health condition, we're always sort of looking for these constellation of markers that help us to paint the picture versus having that real, acute one single marker that will tell us the story. And so I was just going to circle back to the conversation you mentioned there about leptin. So obviously another important regulator of energy metabolism. And that has some significant drops when you get down towards that 30 kcal per kg fat-free mass. Can you talk a bit about leptin and its role in this whole story?
Leptin is actually most likely upstream of T3. Actually, I believe that it would be, T3, or the response of T3 would be more like a response of to leptin,
yeah,
sort of thing. Leptin is very sensitive to fasting, and it's also very, very sensitive to carbohydrate intake. So you would normally see when you get someone to fast, leptin goes down very, very quick. Leptin also changes in the amount of fat tissue. So it's one of these hormones that is kind of regulated by acute changes in diet and by chronic changes in sort of body composition. So it's a lot of people think that, leptin just changes when you lose fat because it's a hormone released by fat, but the acute nutritional status is also important for changes in circulating leptin. So you can see very quick changes in leptin with reduced energy availability. Leptin basically has an effect in the central nervous system. It has an effect on the hypothalamus and the pituitary axis.
Yep.
And that affects, the thyroid axis and the gonadal axis as well. So it seems that really might be sort of a master switch. There are some studies showing that when there is a replacement of leptin in the face of weight loss in obese individuals, then some of the responses or the sort of the thermogenic adaptation responses are damped. So it seems that it's quite an important hormone when it goes under the sort of the baseline level.
Yeah, for sure. And if we then circle back to IGF-1, which you touched on, obviously important for protein synthesis, cell proliferation, with that low energy availability, we're seeing these increased amounts of growth hormone that can occur, but that's actually quite low intakes. I mean, now we're getting down to 20 kcal per kg fat-free mass.
Yeah.
Is that more of a survival switch then that's being activated when someone is having that? I mean, from the outside anyway, it feels like almost starvation mode at that point, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I think really low energy availability is when you have someone who's training a lot and still eating high amounts of food or normal amounts of food and energy, is more like starvation response without the starvation, really. So it really is like a starvation response. So, a lot of things that we study are really trying to understand the starvation response in people who are like having, normal intakes of food, but who are like very physically active. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to see the different constellation of markers, and you talk also about bone markers for resorption formation. Is there some potential there for being able to pick this up as well?
Yeah, definitely. So bone is this sort of tissue that it's even though we think it's not, it's very much alive. It's changing all the time. So it's going like synthesis and resorption all the time, and it's very, very slow. So this sort of is a steady state that the bone is in which the synthesis is the same as the resorption. So the amount of the bone that we have is kind of the same all the time.
Yeah.
But when we get into this low energy availability or like sort of starvation response, one of the things that the body kind of tries to save energy in is like this sort of synthesis of bone. And there are some markers, like blood circulating markers, that can give us an idea of like whether this is changing or not. So even though it would take months to be able to detect like significant or meaningful, let's say, changes in bone metabolism, or on the bone mass, these markers, we can pick them up rather quick, within days of exposure. So we can see, is this having an effect on sort of this synthesis or resorption process? So yeah, there are some markers that are better than others, but normally like beta CTX is a good one, and CPTX and so on. There's a few, osteocalcin and stuff.
Yeah, I mean it's really compelling, isn't it, from a clinician standpoint of being able to pick up some of these earlier markers rather than having to wait down the line for a DEXA scan or something that's going to show you that there's some issues with bone mineral density loss.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is sort of one of the points that we tried to make on a recent review that we wrote for the European Journal of Sports Science, where we are saying like, yeah, of course, when you don't see a menstrual cycle or you see like bone mineral density low, it's like a bit too late. So maybe you can pick some of these responses earlier on with, looking at a series of blood-borne markers. And as you were saying before, sometimes people want their one marker that tells everything, and it's difficult because you might need to sort of tick a few boxes of things being like subclinically lows to have an idea of kind of what's going on. So it's a tricky one to pick up.
Yeah, it sort of gets back to that sort of coach's eye or practitioner's eye or, whatnot, being able to really appreciate all the different factors in the athlete's life to then start to your point, put your finger on the fact that, okay, we're seeing some real relative big changes in certain areas, whether it's the performance, the training, the recovery, or some of these biomarkers.
Yeah.
Now, what about in men versus women? Because menses is obviously a marker that, female athletes are constantly monthly being reminded if menses is regular, whereas in men, it's more new that we're getting more appreciation for this picture of low energy availability and what it might be doing to male athletes.
Yeah, that's a great point. So because of the history or the legacy in the research in this topic, there's been a lot of more research in females than in males. And since about 2014, when this like Red S model sort of comes up, people start going like, hey, this might be happening in males too. And so what's going on here? And the thing is that because males don't have a menstrual cycle, it's harder to see.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it appears that men might be more resistant and resilient to low energy availability. So from the little data that we have, it seems that it's harder to disrupt the sort of the endocrine system or the metabolism in general in men with low energy availability than in females. But yeah, of course, they are susceptible to the effects of acute and chronic low energy availability.
Mm-hmm.
A marker that might be good for males is actually free testosterone. And even though we don't have a real experimental data showing this, like a series of like cross-sectional studies seem to suggest that this is like a quite sensitive marker to low energy availability.
It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, we see that sort of lack of recovery and lack of sleep or overtraining and, insufficient energy intake. All these things can really start to impact something like free testosterone, right?
Yes, totally. And I'm saying I'm being very careful here because a lot of these parameters can be affected by a lot of things. It's not just energy, but there is this saying that when the tool that you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if we think just about energy, then like everything might be, this energy availability or that's energy availability. And in fact, there's a lot of things that can disrupt the endocrine response. And you mentioned one good one there, that is sleep. So, it would be interesting to see whether these things are affected by sleep or not, and to what extent they interact with energy. Probably there's some sort of synergism there. But, I think it's still important to do the experimental trials, with men and try to see whether, to what extent some of these endocrine parameters respond to energy alone and not other parameters.
It's seemingly an increasingly important topic even amongst men. And I know with athletes that I consult with, they're humans too, and they think about body composition, or if somebody on the team is leaner than a certain athlete, then all of a sudden, or scores quote unquote better on a certain body composition test, then whether they're admitting it or not, they sometimes alter their diet to try to get leaner or get into these states of low energy availability without realizing. And then of course we get these trickle down effects on performance, recovery. I was curious, in all your experience in places around the world you've been, there's some examples or some stories that come to mind when thinking about how low energy availability can affect male or female athletes.
Well, I've had a lot of observations. Also, as an athlete myself, I was competing at the sort of decent level in different places, and I always, you're kind of always the first experimental subject when you're doing these things, and when you're doing road cycling at a fairly good competitive level, and you are you know that watts per kilo are important, and you try to drop weight, and you do all these things, you get like a lot of insights by experimenting on yourself. So I suppose I have a lot of insights on this, but I try to steer away a little bit from anecdotes. It's just like even though like I love anecdotes and insights that this might provide to do like a bit of further analysis of what's going on, and they are great to sort of generate curiosity for scientific inquiry. I would be very careful to draw conclusions from even my my own experience, which can be tainted by my successes or failures, let's say. So no, I think it's super interesting, and I think there's a lot to be understood of whether it is the actual energy availability or the acute availability of substrate. I think that's something that is very important to be able to differentiate, because some people get into this, I'm like, low energy availability, this and that, but then maybe they are in low energy availability all the time, but they are also not fueling properly for a race or for a training session. So it's not just the energy availability as a whole, but it can be the availability of substrate for a particular session or race. So sometimes it's hard to say it's one thing or the other.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point to sort of be always going back to examining the entire athlete or client's day and how they're fueling regularly, and then of course how they're fueling during specific training sessions. To your point, if they're these more intense sessions, or especially again if they're doing Ironman or ultra marathon training, now we're getting in some real long, slower but longer duration work.
Yeah.
So, and on that note, you guys touch on sort of protein and carbohydrates a little bit, and the effects there in states of low energy availability, or how that might impact. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, of course. I think one of the things that I like about this topic of energy availability is that it's kind of a crossroads of a lot of different important areas in sports nutrition, and that's why I find it so fascinating, because it's not just the energy; it's the availability of substrate, how you stimulate, protein synthesis or not with protein intake, and so on. So, one of the things that is kind of important for most sports, we think, is to maintain lean mass. And we know that low energy availability decreases myofibrillary protein synthesis, as we've shown in a paper that we published in AJP Endo a few years ago. So that one was as part of my PhD. And, we know that increasing protein intake sort of is able to rescue this sort of decrease in myofibrillary protein synthesis. So even though you might say, okay, this amount of energy availability has this effect on your physiology or your endocrine system and so on, it's very important to consider also the percentage of different macronutrients, or the effect of different macronutrients on the actual physiological response. I mean, I'm saying macronutrients on the diet, of course. So
yeah, I was going to say, I mean, obviously with glycogen acting as a training regulator and periodizing carbohydrates becoming much more popular and understood, and the athletes now trying to train more with lower carbohydrate availability, there could be the potential there. I mean, perhaps walk us through the benefits there, and then the potential for, basically underfueling if we do it too frequently during some of these more intense sessions, or as you alluded to earlier, during race day.
So, one of the current theories or ideas is that training with low skeletal muscle glycogen can potentially enhance the oxidative capacity of skeletal muscle. That, when repeated over time, then this leads to an enhanced response in the sort of muscle to generate energy via oxidative pathways.
Yeah.
The problem with this is that if you do it chronically and you do it, if you don't
fall in love with it, you do it every day, it becomes a problem.
Yes. On the one side, you have low energy and, you have all these negative responses, potentially negative responses to chronic low energy availability, but also because you get really bad at burning carbs. Yeah. And then, we know that burning carbs is important for high intensity sport, and most race winning moves in pretty much any sport, unless it's like probably like ultra marathon, like
long and slow.
Yeah, long and slow, exactly. And then you need to have the capacity to burn these carbs. So, for these two reasons, it seems that, it might not be the best idea. One of the things that we researched during my postdoc was what happens, when you train, you do like a sleep low protocol. Are you familiar with the sleep? Would your listeners be familiar?
Yeah, just review it for folks. But yeah, it'd be great.
So a sleep low protocol is basically this training protocol where you train hard in the evening of day one, let's say. So you use a lot of your muscle glycogen. And then on the morning of day two, you train again at lower intensity, or a session that might not be so tasking. Basically, you cannot make it very tasking because your skeletal muscle glycogen is low. Because on the evening before, after your hard session, you really then put back all the carbs necessary to resynthesize all the skeletal muscle
like
glycogen.
Protein-based meal with some fats and some probably leafy greens and veggies, right? Something like that.
Something like that would do the job, for example. Yeah. So you can have a little bit of carbs, but don't top up.
It's not the pasta meal that we should be.
No, exactly. Yeah. And one of the things that we looked into was like, okay, let's look at what happens if, for example, you have a low carbohydrate meal after that evening session, but you put all the energy that you use on the session with fat. And say like, if energy availability is important to modulate the response, if we put back the energy, then you should be seeing like an enhanced response on the morning after, because that energy was put back. And if energy is holding you back from the muscle to adapt, then it can be a good thing. Interestingly, what we observed, so we did this thing where we got our participants, which were like well-trained athletes. We have like a national 10 trial champion in the mix, and we're like really good athletes, mostly cyclists. And we took muscle biopsies after the second session in the morning. We looked at a lot of markers of mitochondrial biogenesis, like intracellular signaling and gene expression and so on. And interestingly, there didn't seem to be any differences between group, and even some markers that are related to mitochondrial biogenesis were potentially actually enhanced in the low energy group. So the group that didn't have all the energy in the form of fat.
Yeah.
In fact, the group that had all the energy back, mostly in the form of fat, when they had a post-exercise meal with the typical post-exercise sort of protein plus carbohydrates meal, they saw like an impaired glucose regulation just after one meal, which for me was mind-blowing. It was like, wow, there was just one meal and you see this sort of impaired glucose regulation, which was very, very interesting. So as much as we can talk about, thresholds of energy availability or not, and so on, I think it's very important to consider the timing and amounts of macronutrients intake also to interpret, what might be going on in terms of the physiological responses.
Yeah, I mean, like to sum it up for someone who sort of having those periods, a few periods of training and with low carb availability could be beneficial, but to your point earlier, we've got to really watch how much we're doing this, because we could start to elicit some serious issues, especially if you're really trying to push that upper end, because we don't want to be compromising carbohydrate oxidation when we're trying to win the race, right?
Yeah, of course. And I think, it's as everything, it's really a balancing act. I think one of the things that most people find difficult in sports nutrition and in life in general probably is like balance. And I think, a lot of people get really obsessed with either dropping weight or, doing something just at the one thing. And sometimes it's just you need to mix and match things, and you have to really assess where you're standing and where you want to go, and if that's important, and so on. So, we know that in a lot of sports, weight management is very important. So we could think of all the complications that come together with this, like eating disorders and so on. But I think it's also important to understand, to what extent or at what point some of the effects of low energy availability become negative, and at what point they actually are something that can be beneficial for performance. And I think this is very difficult, but I think it's important to keep in mind that athletes sometimes do need to lose weight, and that's part of the sport.
Yeah, 100%, and definitely those sports that have the weight making categories, etc. Can it's interesting because there's potentially the most application there, but then to your point, we've got to be mindful of how we apply it so we don't start to get some of these adverse effects. Now,
yes.
What about the future of research in this area? Now you're at the forefront of it. Can you walk us through, without giving away any trade secrets, what some areas of potential interest might be coming down the pipeline?
No, look, I think that there's a lot to be done. First, on male athletes, try to understand better what's happening in males, and I feel a little bit ashamed of saying this, to be honest, because it's so uneven, the amount of research that there's on males.
I was going to say, it's probably the only area where there's not a lot of
it's probably the only area. Yeah. And I'm all for equality, so I'm like supporting the female research whenever I can, and so on. So I said, okay, but for this area, something that we need to understand a little bit better is this. I think we also need potentially more prolonged periods of, sort of controlled or measured energy availability in athletes, mm-hmm. and see, what different parameters change with time. I think we need to understand what's happening really on the field, because we assume a lot of things are happening on the field, but we don't really have a lot of data. Mm-hmm. I think this is very important. We have some interesting studies in the pipeline there. I think it would be really interesting to look more into potential markers, so to define better what markers we can measure to say, this person, is this is low energy, and because it ticks that and that box, then yes, that we can say that with a degree of certainty this person is under fueling. But again, I think this is complex again, because the way our physiology works, we respond to stresses, and energetic stress might be a stress that is necessary to drive adaptation.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying, chronically put someone under stress, because this is, we know that when you do that chronically, it's also not good. So again, I think it's a balancing act, because and we need to understand to what point this sort of degree of stress can generate an adaptive response, and when it's too much.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Just like exercise, whether it's strength training, aerobic training, inducing that stress just to the point where we can get that adaptation, get that inflammatory response that we're after, to be able to adapt and grow stronger and fitter. But if we push it too far, if we don't, if that training load is too high and too intense for too long, then all of a sudden, too much of a good thing. And it's interesting how, the same can be applied on the nutrition front as well.
Yeah, totally. And another thing that I think is interesting to look into, when I was saying, looking at, parameters, I think there's a future to look at resting metabolic rate as a parameter potentially for being able to detect whether a person is undergoing, more prolonged or more severe periods of low energy availability. I think that's something really interesting.
Absolutely. Is there certain drops that one might expect or predict? I mean, I know it's obviously early days, but...
Yeah, well, so again, this has been more research in females, and there's really interesting studies by Mary Jane D'Souza from a university in the US. The name is not coming to my head. It's not a UConn. What university is? I forgot now.
I've got 3 small kids at home, so I spend most of my days wondering, trying to remember things.
Yeah, so she's doing really, really interesting research in this area. And, one of the things that they show is that the energy sort of conservation markers, all these markers that we were talking about before, they're kind of correlated to the severity of the decrease in resting metabolic rate. So one of the things that it's normally compared against, the current resting metabolic rate of females, is the resting metabolic rate measured against the predicted.
Yep.
So a cut-off value normally used of 0.9. So if a measured resting metabolic rate is less than 90% of that predicted, that might be an indicator that there is a degree of severity of sort of chronic exposure to low energy availability. In men, this is less clear, but I wouldn't be surprised that the threshold is thereabouts too.
Yeah, good opportunity to revisit the fueling, the training plan, the recovery, and all that to be able to see, what one uncovers. But Jose, I could pick your brain here all afternoon, but I appreciate you carving out some time today. If people want to stay connected with you and your research and your work, what's the best place to find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. I'm not extremely active on Twitter, but I tweet things that are mostly related to this topic and other topics in sports nutrition. And my username or handle, to use the right term, is JL Areta. So JLARETA. And yeah, you can find me there. Follow me, and I share stuff there. Or just if you're curious about anything what I'm saying, just reach out over email, and I'll do my best to reply.
Fabulous. Well, we'll put that up as well as your papers in the show notes. And again, really appreciate you carving out some time today.
No, thank you so much for the invitation, Mark. Really appreciate it.